Hans Holbein the Younger was born in 1497 in Augsburg, Germany, to a family of Gothic religious painters, and he's considered the only outstanding German painter of his generation. He painted many portraits of humanists, thinkers, and nobles during his lifetime, and most notably, he became the official portrait artist of King Henry VIII in 1537. In the last 10 years of his life, under the employ of the king, he painted approximately 150 portraits of royalty and nobles. Though Holbein's ability to delicately and lavishly render reality is one of the reasons his art has transcended through the years, his use of symbolism and memento mori in response to the turbulent political and religious standing of the 16th century is what has truly made him exemplary. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, memento mori is a warning or reminder of the inevitability of death, especially a skull or another symbolic object. The phrase first came into proverbial use in 1474, and the first print use of memento mori was in 1598 by Shakespeare in his play King Henry IV, Part 1. This theme grew to intense relevance during the lifetime of Holbein, due to plague epidemics, the Protestant Reformation, and the initial introduction of the heliocentric model in 1514. And memento mori is seen in the works of Shakespeare and John Donne, largely because of the works of Holbein. In 1533, Holbein painted his famous portrait The Ambassadors, which was of two French ambassadors, Jean de Donville and Georges du Selve, who were in England to keep an eye on King Henry VIII as he planned to break away from the Catholic Church. This painting has many symbols within it pregnant with meaning. For example, Jean de Donville is standing on the left with his hand on a dagger representing the active life. Georges de Selve on the right stands with his elbow on a pile of books representing the contemplative life. The items on the shelves hold its significance as well. On the top shelf is the celestial sphere, and there lies many tools for the study of astronomy and measurement of time. On the bottom shelf represents the earthly sphere. There's a lute, a geographic globe, and an open hymnal. The lute next to the hymnal has a broken string, which is a classical allusion to discord, and the hymnal it's next to has inscribed upon it a hymn written by Martin Luther. The floor of a painting is reference to an actual floor in Westminster Abbey, which is a representation of the macrocosm, the order of the universe. Superimposed in the middle of the canvas is a driftwood-esque blob, extending diagonally across the floor. When looked at from a certain angle, this blob reveals itself to be a memento mori, a realistic painting of a skull. One must stand at such an angle in order to see the skull, that when the skull is visible, the rest of the painting is not, suggesting that death is an ethereal and incomprehensible aspect of being alive, and that all else is insignificant in relation to the inevitability of death. The other hidden aspect of the painting is a crucifix peeking out of the upper left-hand corner of the curtain. This suggests that death and the promise of salvation by Christ are the only elements that will remain throughout the passage of time. Another painting by Holbein, a portrait of the merchant George Guise, represents Guise in lavish clothing surrounded by his wealth and the tools of his trade. However, upon the examination of the items on his desk, there are two things that stick out: a small golden clock and a fragile glass vase holding flowers. The clock is a classical allusion to the passage of time in life. The clock is in dialogue with the fragile vase and flowers, and together they serve as a memento mori. The portrait of Sir Brian Tuke serves as a memento mori as well. It seems at first glance as a simple portrait. The paper he is pointing to, however, is inscribed with a short passage from the Book of Job, reading, "Are the days of my life not few?" These paintings and the theme of memento mori relate closely to the literature of the time immediately following Holbein's death. For example, many of the themes in The Ambassadors relate to William Shakespeare's play Hamlet. The reflection of the active and contemplative life presented in the painting is closely related to the beloved to be or not to be speech. The Shakespearean tragedy itself is steeped with the theme of memento mori. For example, the tragedy Othello includes the line, "'Tis destiny unshunnable like death," in response to growing doubts about the faithfulness of Desdemona, who according to some interpretations represents Christ. This, like the works of Holbein, holds the inevitability of death very closely to religious doubt and discord. An influence of the Shakespearean tragedy was the medieval tragic poem, poetic verse accounts of death and disaster usually coming to kings and great rulers. The poems emphasize that death and suffering come even to the great, without regard for merit or station, in the same fashion every time. Shakespeare epitomizes this aspect in his tragedies in the graveyard scene of Hamlet, when the young prince says, "Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away." Similarly, memento mori in the medieval tragic poem is the thesis of one of Holbein's earliest works, The Dance of Death, which is a series of 41 woodcut illustrations depicting death's entrance into the world. The woodcuts start with the fall of man, then depict death as its clutches enwrap everyone throughout the social hierarchy, beginning with the Pope and working its way down to the beggar. Another theme of the tragic poem is Contemptuous Mundi, contempt for the world. Poems working with this theme are established in 3 parts: Ubi sunt, where are they, Timor mortis, fear of death, and Memento Mori, the inevitability of death. The theme Contemptuous Mundi was commonly preached by churchmen during the recurrent plague epidemics in Europe. There are several epidemics during Holbein's lifetime, one of which killing him in 1543 at the age of 46. Contemptuous Mundi is seen in Holbein's Dance of Death, and as stated before, the theme of Memento Mori was recurrent in many of his works, along with the literature before and after his lifetime, including poems of John Donne, such as Death Be Not Proud and For Whom the Bell Tolls. Both engage in a dialogue with death in such a religious way. Just as the Ambassadors promises death and salvation with a skull and a crucifix, Donne does much the same with his reflections on human mortality. Donne was also married to Anne More, the great-grandniece of Sir Thomas More, who was painted famously by Holbein in 1527. The macrocosm represented in the Ambassadors also relates to the poems by John Donne, such as The Sun Rising, which relates the lover and beloved to the heavenly spheres revolving each other, and the famous line in Hamlet, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than dreamt of in our philosophy." Memento Mori. Everyone dies, and yet so little is known about death, and what largely makes an artist is the ability to harness the fear of dying into some form of art or literature that grants them, in a way, immortality. Holbein, Donne, and Shakespeare all took timor mortis, their fear of death, and used it to ensure that their arts never die. And though every individual human on earth is there for such an infinitesimal blink in the face of eternity, the works of these men truly transcend the mortal coil and influence artistic infinities to come.
That everyone you know someday will die. And instead of saying all of your goodbyes, let them know you